Thank you. What a glorious morning it is outside. It's a beautiful day. Thank you for coming. America is not just experiencing growing pains, though. America, I believe, is in a full-blown crisis, a spiritual crisis. Soothing voices seek to reassure us, to say that everything's okay, everything's just fine, all is well, until one day all is not well. The problem, as Os Guinness puts it, is not wolves at the door, it's termites in the floor. Our foundation is cracking. It's not that we've chosen the wrong politicians, although there is some truth to that. It's more fundamental. We've arrived at a crossroads. We've arrived at a day of reckoning. Will we falter or will we thrive and rediscover our mojo? America has much greatness left in her, I'm convinced of it. If we believe in ourselves, if we believe in our founding documents, if we believe in the system that made us the richest, freest, and most humanitarian nation ever. But cracks are evident. The sand is shifting. Our moral compass is wavering. Os Guinness makes this point when he states that the only proper restraint for freedom is self-restraint. What does that mean? It means those of us who love freedom must realize that freedom is not a license to do as you please. Freedom can only be realized when citizens know self-restraint, or put another way, virtue. This parallels what George Washington's belief that democracy requires a virtuous people. Think American Revolution versus the French Revolution. Laws, though, don't ultimately restrain people. 98% of the people will follow a virtuous course with or without laws. Now, this isn't to say that we shouldn't have laws or that we don't need laws, but what we need is something more than laws. We need something that civilizes a nation, and that is virtue. What America needs is not just another politician or more promises. What America really needs is a revival. 200 years ago, Thomas Paine wrote, "These are the times that try men's souls." The question is now as important as it was then. Will you be sunshine patriots, shrinking and gone when the going gets tough? Or will you stand shoulder to shoulder to defend the Republic? As your representative, I swore an oath to defend the Republic against enemies foreign and domestic. Now that I've been to Washington and I've seen the belly of the beast, I can tell you that I've met the enemy, and the enemy is too often right here in this town. In Congress, and frankly, many times in both parties. In bipartisan fashion, Congress defies its own rules. They're supposed to publish the bills in advance so we can read the bills. Reading the bills shouldn't be too difficult, should it? The president acts like he's a king. He ignores the Constitution. He arrogantly says, "If Congress will not act, then I must." These are not the words of a great leader. These are the words that sound more like the exclamations of an autocrat. In the face of war, the president is just as arrogant. Instead of coming to Congress, he illegally acts on his own. We are faced with a crisis in the Middle East that does require action. While I am one who is hesitant to be involved in the civil wars of the Middle East, ISIS is now a threat to our consulate in Erbil. They are a threat to our embassy in Baghdad. We should act, but we should act within the rule of law. The Constitution says that only Congress may declare war. Yet this president has in Libya, and then this week in Syria, committed our sons and daughters to a war that is not authorized by Congress. Had I been president, I would have called for a joint session of Congress. I would have laid out the threat. And I would have requested congressional authority to respond as the Constitution dictates. By failing to follow the Constitution, this president missed a chance to unite the nation. He missed a chance to galvanize the country. He missed a chance to become a great American leader. How did we stray so far from the Constitution? And how do we find our way back to the traditions of our founders? Don Devine is a friend of mine who worked in the Reagan administration. He wrote in a book recently about how freedom and tradition are intertwined. He wrote, "Freedom needs tradition for law, order, and inspiration. But tradition needs freedom to escape stagnation, coercion, and decline." The great achievement of the Constitution's framers was in providing a means for synthesizing freedom and tradition. America needs to revive tradition. America needs to revive virtue. America needs to revive the hope that springs eternal from the transcendent teachings of a humble carpenter who died upon a cross. Government can supply bread, but it can't mend a broken spirit. Mother Teresa was once praised for her social work in India, and she replied, "We are not social workers. We do this for Jesus." No secular government, no social worker can claim the same motivation. No government, no law can force a people to be virtuous. Our churches, our schools, our parents must fill that void. This isn't the norm now. Speaking of a revival, speaking of our values, is sadly considered nonconformity in this day and age. In other words, I think we must do something our world often tells us not to do: seek God. Walker Percy laments in The Moviegoer that we've left no room for the seeker. Maybe our country's revival depends on seeking and rediscovering the synthesis of freedom and tradition. Some seem to believe you must choose. It's either liberty or virtue. That to be virtuous, you can't have too much freedom. This is exactly wrong. Liberty is absolutely essential to virtue. It is our freedom to make individual choices that allows us to be virtuous. Government can't impose virtue. We must impose it upon ourselves. Now, this doesn't mean that government shouldn't or can't reflect our values. It must. The First Amendment is not about keeping religious people out of government. It's about keeping government out of religion. Some seek to separate the issues of our day, separate our debt from the issue of life, separate our charity from our education, separate our values from our government. This doesn't work. Obamacare tries to force us to separate our faith from our business. Fortunately, the Supreme Court thought otherwise. Reagan understood this unity of message when he wrote, "We do not have a separate social agenda, a separate economic agenda, and a separate foreign agenda. We have one agenda. Just as surely as we seek to put our financial house in order and rebuild our nation's defenses, so too we seek to protect the unborn, to end the manipulation of school children by utopian planners, and permit the acknowledgement of our supreme being in our classrooms." Amen. As Christians, we should always stand with the most defenseless. I believe that no civilization can long endure that does not respect life from the not yet born to life's last breath. The debate isn't really about whether government has a role in protecting life. The debate really hinges on when life begins. I've held 1.5-pound babies in my hand. I've seen them sucking their thumb on an ultrasound, and I've seen surgeons operate on babies still in the womb. So don't tell me that 5- and 6-pound babies have no rights simply because they're not yet born. That's right. I'm one who will march for life and will continue to stand up in defense of life as long as I'm privileged to be in office. Another way we as Christians should stand up to the current status quo is in foreign policy. Reagan, in his first speech to the UN, said, "The record of history is clear. Citizens of the U.S. resort to force reluctantly and only when we must." Reagan believed in strength, but he also believed in peace. He said, "As for the enemies of freedom, they will be reminded that peace is the highest aspiration of the American people. Our foreign policy, though, has too often accepted war instead of peace and intervention instead of strength, leading to a host of unintended consequences. Toppling secular dictators in the Middle East led time and time again to chaos, and ultimately that chaos enabled and abetted the rise of radical Islam. As secular dictators fell in Libya, in Egypt, in Iraq, and now Syria, radical jihadists exploited the vacuum, and Christians have been forced to flee. Where will the Syrian Christians go when the civil war breaks down their door? Across the Middle East, the story is the same. Christians are either persecuted or on the run. In Sudan, Miriam Ibrahim is on the run, but I understand she may be here today. Is that right? For her beliefs, she was sentenced to death by the Muslim courts of Sudan. Miriam was raised by a Christian mother and married a Christian man. At the time of her arrest, she had a young son and was pregnant with another. Because Miriam's father was Muslim, though, Islamic law considers Miriam and her son to be Muslim. So when she was arrested, Miriam and her young son were taken to prison. Miriam was forced to give birth in prison, shackled to the floor. When Miriam's Muslim brother was asked about her sentence, he replied, "If she repents and returns to our Islamic faith, then we are a family. But if she refuses, she should be executed." After her conviction, Miriam was given a chance to recant her Christianity and save her life. She refused, declaring, "I am a Christian and I will remain a Christian." That's true bravery. Luckily, Miriam was granted asylum, and she's now here in the United States. But there are many more like her. Across the globe, Christians are under attack, as if we lived in the Middle Ages, or as if we lived under early pagan Roman rule. In Libya, once the secular dictator Gaddafi fell, radical jihadists raided Christian churches, rounding up hundreds of Christians, accusing them of being missionaries because they possessed Bibles and crosses. Many were tortured, and one Christian died while being tortured. In Pakistan, Asia Bibi, a Christian, sits on death row for blasphemy. She says it all began when she drew water from a Muslim villager's well. As she was filling her bowl of water, the crowd formed, chanting, "Death! Death to the Christian!" She pleaded for her life. She was pelted with stones, punched in the face, dragged through the streets. The local imam finally intervened, only to say, "If you don't want to die, you must convert to Islam." The crowd descended on her, beating her with sticks. Finally, the police stopped her attackers, only to arrest her. For several years now, Asia Bibi has been on death row for the alleged crime of blasphemy. Until Asia Bibi is freed, Pakistan should not receive a penny of U.S. aid. Not a penny should go to any nation that persecutes or kills Christians. I can't imagine why we would do this. And you would think, I believe the American public believes this, there's no way we should do this. And you'd think your representatives up here would get it, but they don't. This summer I introduced legislation to stop foreign aid to any country that has the death penalty or life in prison for Christians or other religions for making religious freedom choices. Both Republican and Democrats voted against this amendment overwhelmingly. The committee voted 16-2 to continue this indiscriminate aid to these countries regardless of whether they persecute Christians. I don't think anybody out in America really agrees with that, and that's why you really have to stand up and send a message to them up here, because they're not listening. Our foreign policy also must let us stand with Israel. That's why this year I introduced a bill to cut off all aid to the Palestinian Authority and Hamas until they lay down their arms, stop firing their rockets, and publicly recognize Israel's right to exist. The irony is impossible to escape. Our tax dollars, your tax dollars, may well end up funding Hamas, allowing them to buy more missiles with your money. My bill was opposed by Republican and Democrat leaders. Instead, this week, Congress voted to arm the Islamic rebels in Syria. One group of these so-called moderate rebels has stated publicly that when they're done with Assad, they're coming for Israel. They'll take back the Golan Heights. That's next on their list. I asked on the Senate floor last week, I said, to those of you who wish to arm these Islamic rebels, tell me who among them will recognize Israel's right to exist. Silence. No one answered because not one of these Islamic rebels will ever think about recognizing Israel. In country after country, mobs burn the American flag and chant "Death to America." Congress's response? Congress responds by sending more of your money to these haters of Christianity. I say not one penny more to any nation that is burning our flag. It's time to put a stop to this madness. Re-examine our foreign policy, halt all aid to Islamic radicals in Syria, Egypt, and elsewhere, and take a good hard look at what our foreign policy has done. You and I must and should stand with our fellow Christians in the Middle East, around the world. But that does not necessarily mean war, and it certainly does not mean arming both sides in every conflict. As Christians, you have to lay it out simple to the people in Washington. They'll never get it. As Christians, we understand that the right to life and freedom of religion pre-exist all government. These rights are not granted to man by other men. These rights are granted to us by our Creator. God help us in these troubling times to make wise decisions, to make moral decisions, and to listen to the voice of God that lives and breathes and resides in us all. I try to remember each day Corinthians 3:17. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. I hope Christians everywhere will remember that the reverse is true. Where there is liberty, there is always plenty of space for God. Thank you very much for having me.